The moment my son-in-law grabbed my daughter's arm across the kitchen table and told her she was embarrassing herself in front of guests, his mother smiled and reached for her glass of Pinot Gris like she had just watched something perfectly normal unfold. She swirled the wine slowly. She did not look away. She looked at my daughter the way a person looks at a child who has just been corrected and needed it. I did not move. I did not speak. I set down my fork, folded my hands in my lap, and I watched every face in that room. Because I have been a social worker for 31 years in this province, and I know one thing about dangerous systems: they never reveal themselves as dangerous. They reveal themselves as reasonable. My job, my entire career, had been to read what people were too afraid to say out loud. And sitting at that table in a house that smelled like expensive candles and freshly painted walls, I understood with a cold and absolute certainty that my daughter had been living inside something I had helped hundreds of families escape. I just hadn't seen it happening to my own child. My name is Gloria. I am 63 years old, and I live in Abbotsford, British Columbia, in the same house I have owned for 27 years. The backyard has a Japanese maple that turns the color of rust every October, and for most of my life, that tree was the thing I looked forward to most when the seasons changed. I raised my daughter in that house. I made mistakes there, and I had good years there. My husband, Edmund, died in that house 11 years ago now, after a brief and brutal fight with cancer. He was 56. He was the kind of man who remembered how his children took their tea and kept a running list of their small victories on a notepad inside his desk drawer. My daughter grew up watching her father listen more than he spoke. She grew up understanding that gentleness was not weakness. She became an architect, which surprised no one who knew her. She had been rearranging the furniture in her bedroom since she was 9 years old, convinced that how a room was shaped determined how the people inside it felt. She worked for a firm in Vancouver that specialized in affordable housing design. She believed buildings could be an act of dignity. She said that once in an interview that ran in a local magazine, and I cut it out and kept it on my fridge. She met my son-in-law at a charity gala in Yaletown, the kind of event where men in dark suits talk about the communities they are investing in while never quite having to live in them. He was a financial advisor, senior director at a wealth management firm with offices in downtown Vancouver and Calgary. He had a confident laugh. He spoke about her work with what seemed like genuine fascination. He told her that most people in his industry only thought about money, and that she was proof that some people still thought about people. She called me the next morning and said, "Mom, I think I met someone interesting. Not exciting. Not handsome. Interesting." That was so entirely my daughter that I smiled for the rest of that day. They dated for 2 years before the wedding. He proposed on a weekend trip to Tofino. He flew her parents, meaning only me by then, out to meet his family at a dinner in West Vancouver, in a house on the hillside with a view of the water that felt more like a statement than a home. His mother was impeccably dressed and warm, in a way that had been practiced so many times it had become indistinguishable from sincerity. She complimented my daughter's career. She said she admired women who built things. She said she hoped they could be close, that she had always wanted a daughter, not just a son. I noticed, even then, that she spoke about my daughter as though she were acquiring something. But I told myself I was being protective and suspicious, the occupational hazard of decades in child welfare. I told myself she was simply enthusiastic. I told myself my daughter was a grown woman who knew her own mind. I was right about that last part. She did know her own mind. The trouble was that someone spent the next 3 years convincing her that her mind was wrong. It began so gently that I almost wrote it off as the ordinary friction of 2 people building a life together. He suggested she move her office equipment out of the 2nd bedroom because they might need the space for a guest room. He mentioned, once, and then twice, and then regularly, that some of her colleagues had a tendency to take advantage of her dedication. He asked if the networking events she attended were really necessary, because some of those people, he had heard things. He just wanted her to be careful about her reputation. He said this with such apparent care that she thanked him for it. His mother visited often, sometimes without notice. She would arrive with food, with opinions delivered as observations. She said things like, "I noticed the fridge is a bit bare. Are you eating properly?" She said things like, "I know you work hard, but men like my son need a certain kind of energy at home." She said things like, "I hope you're not letting your career make you unavailable to him." These sentences were never quite criticisms. They were close enough to concern that my daughter apologized for the things they implied. She stopped calling me during her lunch break. Those calls had been hours for years, 15 minutes on her walk to the coffee shop near her office, talking about nothing and everything. When I asked about them, she said she was just busy. He preferred she keep her phone put away during the workday. It helped her focus. It helped her focus. That was how it was framed. Then the long sleeves started. I noticed them in the fall, when she came out to Abbotsford for Thanksgiving. It was warm enough that week that I had the back door open to the garden. She wore a long-sleeved shirt and kept the cuffs pulled down. I asked if she was cold. She said she had been running the air conditioning too high at home and gotten into the habit. I set a hand on her forearm gently, the way I had done 1,000 times, and she pulled back before I touched her. Not dramatically. Just enough. I asked her directly, standing at the kitchen counter while she helped me slice the squash, if she felt safe. She laughed. Not a real laugh. A managed one. "Mom, you work in child protection. You see danger everywhere." "I'm fine. He's never raised a hand to me." I heard the precision in that sentence. Never raised a hand. Not never hurt me. Not he would never. Never raised a hand. I had been a social worker long enough to understand the difference between what someone says and what they allow themselves to say. But she was 35 years old, and she had not asked for my help, and so I waited. I watched. I started keeping notes in a small green notebook that I kept in the drawer beside my bed. Dates. Details. The things I observed, and the things she said that landed sideways in my chest. The dinner happened in March. His mother had suggested a family gathering at their house in South Surrey, a newer build in one of those neighborhoods where every lawn is the same shade of green. She had cooked. She was an excellent cook, and she knew it, and used it the way certain people use gifts, as a demonstration of control. My daughter had brought a salad and a bottle of wine. There were 2 other couples there, friends of his, people who laughed loudly at his jokes and called him by a nickname I had never heard before. The evening was polite, in the way that evenings are when something is being suppressed. My daughter moved carefully. She refilled glasses before being asked. She laughed at the right moments and stayed quiet at the others. I watched her scan the room before she spoke, a habit I had not seen in her before, and I recognized it immediately. I had seen it in the children I worked with who had learned that the wrong sentence at the wrong moment had consequences. Then she reached across the table to pass a dish, and her elbow caught the edge of a water glass. It didn't fall. It tipped slightly and righted itself, and a small amount of water spilled onto the tablecloth. Nothing significant. An ordinary accident. He looked at her the way a person looks when they want you to understand something, without saying it aloud. Slow. Deliberate. He placed his hand over hers on the table, firmly, and said, in a voice that was perfectly conversational, "Perhaps a little more care next time, sweetheart." His mother laughed. She said, "The clumsy ones keep you on your toes, And then she looked at my daughter with something in her eyes that was not amusement. It was a reminder. You know better than this. She took a slow sip from her wine glass and moved the conversation forward as though nothing had happened. My daughter's eyes found mine across the table. They were not asking for rescue. They were apologizing. And that was the worst thing I had ever seen. I did not react. I smiled and asked one of the other couples about their recent trip to Halifax. I stayed composed in the way I had trained myself to stay composed in rooms where composure was the only thing that kept the situation from collapsing. But inside, I had already made the decision. Not an emotional one, a professional one. I had spent 3 decades building a network of people in this province who knew how to document harm and build cases that held up. I was not going to confront anyone at a dinner table in South Surrey. I was going to do what I had always done. I was going to prepare. In the weeks after the dinner, I noticed how the system around my daughter had been quietly closing in. A colleague she had mentioned often stopped coming up in conversation. A community project she had been leading, a consultation process for a new affordable housing site in Burnaby, was suddenly handed off to a junior associate at her firm. When I asked about it, she said there had been some concerns about her availability, about her focus. She said she had been distracted lately, and maybe it was for the best. I asked her who had said she was distracted. She paused. He had mentioned it to a few people, she said carefully. He was just trying to help. He had contacts at the firm's board level, and he had put in a word, and maybe the timing hadn't been right for that particular project. He had her best interests in mind. I had been in enough rooms where that sentence had been used to recognize it for what it was. He had started on her professional life. That was new, or it was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. I called my former colleague, a woman who had retired from the Ministry of Children and Family Development after 34 years, and now ran a domestic violence advocacy network out of New Westminster. I described what I had observed without naming anyone. She asked 3 questions. When did the isolation from friends and family begin? When did the professional interference start? Were there physical signs? I answered all 3. She said, "Gloria, you already know what this is." I did. I had known since Thanksgiving. But knowing and acting are 2 different kinds of courage, and when it is your own child, the knowing is the easy part. I started with what I had. I wrote down everything from the green notebook in a formal document. I called my daughter more often, not to ask questions, but to listen, to give her the experience of being heard without condition. I did not mention what I was doing. I drove out to Vancouver one Saturday and asked if we could walk along the seawall, just the 2 of us, the way we had when she was younger. She said yes, and when we were walking, somewhere between the aquarium and the rowing club, she started crying without warning, and could not explain why. I held her hand and said nothing. Let her cry. Let the silence do what silence does when it is offered without demand. Then she said, "I don't know who I am anymore." I said, "I do. And I'm not going anywhere." She squeezed my hand and looked out at the water. She did not say anything more. But something shifted. I could feel it, a fraction, a crack in the wall they had built around her. What happened next was not something I had arranged. It found me. 3 weeks after our walk, I received a private message through the Advocacy Network's intake line, forwarded to me by my former colleague. It was from a woman who identified herself only as a former employee of his family's property management company, the side business his mother ran separately from his wealth management work. She said she had left after 18 months because she had seen things she could not explain away. She said she had kept records. She said she had been waiting for someone who would know what to do with them. We met at a Tim Hortons in Coquitlam, the kind of place that is anonymous by design. She was in her 40s, careful, watchful, in the way that people who have worked in close proximity to controlling people learn to be watchful. She passed me a USB drive across the table without ceremony. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and opened it. The first folder contained emails between his mother and a property manager in Calgary discussing how to handle a tenant who had filed a complaint with the Residential Tenancy Authority. The language was measured, but the intent was clear. Discredit the tenant, delay the process, make the complaint expensive enough to abandon. There were 7 such cases documented over 4 years. Vulnerable tenants, mostly newcomers to Canada, mostly people who did not know their rights or could not afford to enforce them. The second folder was more personal. There were messages between his mother and her son discussing my daughter well before the wedding. She was described as someone with strong opinions that would need to be managed. There was a line that stopped my breath. She will be an asset once she understands the arrangement. Another message, sent after they had been engaged for 6 months, said simply, "The project is on track. Don't get sentimental." The third folder was the one I had not expected. There was a financial complaint filed with the BC Securities Commission 3 years earlier, quietly withdrawn before any formal investigation began. His name. A client who had been an elderly widow in West Vancouver, her entire RRSP and savings moved into high-risk private placements without adequate disclosure. The complaint had been withdrawn after a settlement that required non-disclosure. The woman's daughter had signed it, citing her mother's declining health and the family's desire to avoid prolonged stress. There were 2 more names, similar patterns, all resolved privately, all silent. He had not built a career on wealth management. He had built it on identifying people who were either too trusting or too vulnerable to hold him accountable. My daughter was both when she met him. She was grieving her father, and she was in love. And she had believed, as so many careful and intelligent people believe, that love is the thing that makes someone trustworthy. I called my former colleague that night. I told her what I had found. She connected me with a lawyer she trusted, a woman who specialized in family law and had worked with the RCMP on financial abuse cases involving intimate partner violence. We met within the week. The lawyer was direct. The financial material was actionable if the affected parties chose to come forward again, and there were now additional patterns that strengthened any future complaint. The domestic documentation, the physical evidence, the isolation, the professional interference, those were the foundation for a protection order. But every step had to be my daughter's. She had to be the one to choose. I drove to Vancouver on a Thursday afternoon, and I brought tea in a thermos, and I sat in my daughter's kitchen while she stood at the counter not quite looking at me. I told her everything I had found. I did not soften it. I had spent my career learning that softening the truth is a form of disrespect, that it assumes the person in front of you cannot bear what is real. My daughter was one of the strongest people I knew. She deserved the truth. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked one question. Did he know what his mother did to those tenants? I said, "The emails suggest he did." She sat down. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She said, "I kept telling myself it wasn't that bad. I kept comparing it to worse things I had heard about. I thought I was overreacting." I said, "The thing they teach people in abusive systems is to use other people's suffering as the benchmark. If it's not the worst thing you've ever heard, you convince yourself it doesn't count." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I'm so tired, Mom." I said, "I know, and you don't have to be strong right now, but when you're ready, I'm standing right here." She called the lawyer herself 2 days later. What followed was not clean or simple. It never is. He became hostile the moment he understood she was serious. There were calls from his colleagues implying she was unstable. A story circulated in the social circle they shared that she had experienced a mental health crisis and was making accusations she would regret. Someone sent a message to her firm suggesting she had been behaving erratically. His mother called me personally, once, and told me that interfering mothers destroyed marriages, and that I would be the reason my daughter ended up alone. I said, "I've heard worse threats from people with more to lose. Thank you for calling." Then I documented the call and sent the notes to the lawyer. She moved out of their shared house on a Tuesday morning while he was at work. She took what was hers, which was less than it should have been, because she had stopped insisting on what was hers a long time ago. She came to Abbotsford. She slept in her old room for 3 weeks, and I did not ask her to talk. I just made sure there was food, and the door was unlocked, and the Japanese maple was doing what it always did in the spring, coming back. The protection order was granted within 6 weeks. The financial complaints were reopened by 2 of the original parties after the lawyer made contact. The BC Securities Commission began a formal review. His mother's property management company was investigated by the residential tenancy branch following an anonymous tip that referenced specific case files. He did not go quietly. He filed a counter-complaint against my daughter alleging she had stolen documents and committed defamation. The lawyer handled it efficiently. When the court saw the documentation we had assembled against the thinness of his claims, the judge dismissed his application in less than 40 minutes. My daughter was in the room for that. She sat straight in her chair. She did not cry. She looked at him when the decision was read, and I watched something leave her face. Not anger, not satisfaction, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight they were never supposed to carry and has finally been allowed to set it down. She did not speak to him again after that day. It has been just over 2 years now. She is back in Vancouver, in a 1-bedroom apartment in East Van, with high ceilings and a reading corner she designed herself, a place that is entirely, unapologetically hers. She went back to her firm. The project in Burnaby was eventually reopened, different timeline, same vision, and she is leading it again. She told me recently that she had designed a small pocket park into the plan, a sheltered seating area tucked between 2 residential buildings, intended as a place where people could sit without purpose or performance, somewhere to simply exist. I told her that sounded like her father's kitchen table. She laughed. A real one, not managed, not careful. She is in a relationship now, someone she met through work, a civil engineer who asks her opinion about things and then actually listens to the answer. She told me early on that she had been upfront with him about her history, not as a warning but as an introduction. "This is who I am," she said she told him. "This is what I've been through." He said, "Then I'm glad you got out. What do you want for dinner?" She called me at 9 in the morning to tell me about that conversation, laughing and a little tearful. I sat at my kitchen table and looked out at the Japanese maple and cried right along with her. His mother's company faced significant financial penalties after the tenancy investigation. Several of the affected families were compensated through a mediation process. His own securities review resulted in a formal reprimand, the loss of his senior designation, and conditions on his continued registration that effectively ended his work with high-net-worth private clients. The carefully assembled image took about 14 months to fully collapse, not in a dramatic single moment, but the way false things eventually collapse. Incrementally, quietly, and completely. I want to say something about what it felt like to watch all of that happen from the outside. It did not feel like victory. It felt like what it was, a correction, a slow, expensive, exhausting correction of something that should never have been built in the first place. The people who asked me, afterward, how I stayed calm, how I didn't walk into that dinner and say something, how I didn't call her firm myself, or confront his mother on the phone, I tell them the same thing. Calm is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision to act from clarity instead of reaction. I have sat across from people who hurt children for my entire career, and I have never once helped a child by losing my composure in front of the person causing harm. You lose the moment you show them what you're afraid of. And what they are afraid of is the truth, documented and spoken clearly by someone who is not afraid to speak it. I wrote this because my daughter asked me to. She said someone should say it plainly, that this happens to people who are smart, who are educated, who should know better, because the people who build these systems are very good at making the target believe that their own intelligence is the problem. She said someone should say that your mother noticing something is not an attack on your independence. It is love, doing the hardest thing love has to do, which is wait. She said someone should say that it took her a long time to call it what it was, and she doesn't feel ashamed of that anymore. Neither do I. Before I end, I want to leave you with what I have learned, not just from this, but from 31 years of working with families in crisis and 1 year of living inside one myself. The first thing is this: control rarely looks like control at the beginning. It looks like protection. It looks like love. It looks like someone who cares so much about your well-being that they are simply trying to help you avoid mistakes. Pay attention to how you feel after those conversations. If you feel smaller than when they started, that is information. The second, isolation is the mechanism, not the goal. The goal is to become the only voice. Watch what happens when someone begins to narrow your world and calls it simplification. The third, your children's silence is not the same as their safety. Ask the questions anyway. Ask them gently. Ask them without needing an answer right away. And then listen not just to what they say, but to what they are too tired to say. The fourth, leaving costs something. It costs comfort and certainty, and sometimes your professional reputation, and sometimes friendships you thought were real. Staying costs more, not all at once, slowly, and then all at once. And the fifth, you are allowed to help without being asked if you are careful. You are allowed to document what you observe. You are allowed to build the foundation before your loved one is ready to walk out the door. You are allowed to wait. Waiting is not the same as doing nothing. If any part of this story sounds familiar to you, I am not going to tell you what to do. You already know more than you think you know. What I will tell you is that the clarity you are waiting for is not going to arrive on its own. Someone has to hand you the first piece of it. Consider this yours. What part of this story stayed with you? And where in Canada are you watching from? If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your voice is not small. Use it.